Hello again, everyone. Welcome to another episode of our Can You Hear Me podcast, focused on best practices in communications. I'm Rob Johnson, president of Rob Johnson Communications.
And I'm Eileen Rochford, CEO of the marketing and strategy firm, The Harbinger Group. As you know, on Can You Hear Me, we tackle some of the most crucial business-related communications issues of the day. And today is no different because we want to talk about cybersecurity. We know that's a huge catch-all, so let's first talk about what we aren't going to talk about. This conversation is neither about the nuances of cybersecurity or ransomware, nor the challenges of obtaining and maintaining a cybersecurity insurance, which are all very important topics to be sure. We are going to dive into the importance of cybersecurity to your organization, some best practices as it relates to what to do to make sure that you're on the right path to protecting your company, and what can happen to your business if you do not properly prepare, or if a ransomware attack happens to you.
Now, to accomplish this, we have a very special guest joining us today. But before we introduce her, we want to give you a little background about why this is such an important issue for your company. Now, according to a recent Forbes magazine article, the number of data breaches in 2021 will far exceed the numbers for 2020. In that article, Forbes cites a report from the Unit 42 Security Consulting Group, which reported the average ransomware payment climbed 82% to a record $570,000 in the first half of 2021. 312,000 was the number back in 2020. So you can see it's quite a bit of an increase. In fact, ransomware payments have totaled around $102 million a month for companies that have been breached. And even though the general public rarely hears about such attacks, some of the biggest ones that have made headlines in 2021 are Colonial Pipeline and JBS Foods. And the Forbes report stated that ransomware costs will reach $265 billion by 2031, just less than 10 years. That's frightening.
Yikes. Oh my goodness. And according to the 2022 Global Digital Trust Insights Survey report by PwC, investments are pouring into cybersecurity. 69% of companies predict a rise in cyber spending in 2022, compared to 55% this past year. PCH Technologies estimates that the average expenditure on cybersecurity budgets for large businesses will be between $2 million and $5 million. For mid-sized businesses, between $500,000 and $2 million. And small businesses, $500,000 or less will be spent on cybersecurity per year, which are significant numbers depending on the size of your company.
That's true. And we could talk numbers all episode, but we're not going to do that. We have someone who can really shed some light on this important topic. Please welcome Reena Bajowala, a partner at the Ice Miller Law Firm, where she is part of their data security and privacy information technology and software disputes and benefits disputes practices. Reena has extensive litigation and trial experience and regularly advises on data privacy and security with a focus on data breach and cyber security issues. We could go on and on with the resume, but we won't. Reena, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, it's great to have you. And let's start with this troubling reality, as if the stats we just cited weren't troubling enough. Why don't you talk to us about the real threat of ransomware and how, because of the pandemic, tactics for getting it have evolved over the months and say last 20 months?
Absolutely. Well, we're in sort of a perfect storm right now in terms of ransomware. The incidents have gone up dramatically, as you cited, over the last 18 months in particular. And something else has happened over the last 18 months, which is the pandemic. The reality is threat actors really monopolize on times of confusion. So you have people suddenly working from home, policies getting put by the wayside that might prevent some of these ransomware incidents. You also have a lack of proximity to each other. Everybody's working over email as opposed to popping their head in somebody's office to confirm practices. You have companies that are more reliant on technology, overnight going to remote systems that they hadn't used before, and perhaps not thinking through all of the security issues. So ransomware incidents have gone up dramatically. And paired with this is the professionalization of ransomware. You might have heard the term ransomware as a service, but what happens is threat actors actually have a system that they put in place, a business where they develop a brand new ransomware variant. And so for those that are not as familiar, ransomware is just a malware. It's a software that's injected into a system, and it locks up your data and causes other havoc as a company. And so these threat actor groups develop their own unique flavor of ransomware variant and put together a list of victims where they would like individuals to target. They put together a kit and they hire independent contractors essentially to carry out these ransomware attacks. So you have an extreme proliferation of these incidents because of the professionalization of the process.
That is just so awful. Doesn't it just get to you when you hear talking about it, Rob?
Oh yeah, or when you realize how vulnerable you really are, and we're not sitting here trying to we're not sitting here trying to depress people. We're trying to give them a wake up call that this threat is real, and Reena is has a front row seat to it every day.
So because of the holiday season approaching, Reena, is that typically an even more dangerous time for being at risk for ransomware attacks? Or do you anticipate it's going to be even worse this year?
Absolutely. I think along with the other factors that I just mentioned, being in a pandemic, being decentralized, the threat actors really look at our behavior and look at times where we're going to be decentralized. People will be in different countries. People will be out of the office on vacation. And you have additional activities and responsibilities that are happening. So if you get a spoof phishing email from what looks like Amazon confirming a order for a Christmas gift, you might be primed to click on that without thinking it through, like you might when there isn't a major holiday coming up.
Yeah, that's a great point. I had an incident just today, really interesting, tiny side note. A client of ours sent me a text and said, "Does this person work for your company?" And I said, "Yes," but it was someone on a team who never would have interacted with this client. And I said, "Hey, just send me a text, a screenshot of what that looks like." So they did. And I looked at it and it was so obvious that it was a pretty sophisticated, I wouldn't say ransomware, but phishing of some, variety. Your advice might be to be on high alert during holiday season. What else would you suggest that folks do differently?
Absolutely. So trust but verify is the name of the game here. So what your client did is exactly the right thing to do. And ransomware can come from a phishing email. It can come from a variety of different ways that if somebody clicks on a link that's and provides their credentials, or otherwise clicks on a link that installs malware. That is an attack vector. But the threat actors are getting much more sophisticated, as you mentioned. So here you have a threat actor that's gone on LinkedIn perhaps, or other places, to identify specific individuals who you would respond to, or they would respond to in a more likely manner than they otherwise would. And you have just a lot of evolution in those tactics, but absolutely trust but verify is a huge technique that you can use to prevent these incidents. Multi-factor authentication is a technical solution, but I think everybody's had to, after you log into a system, then you get an alert on your phone, for example, and have to type in the code. That is an example of multi-factor authentication. It's sort of two ways to be able to confirm your identity so that you can get into a system. So implementing things like that is really helpful. And just generally being on high alert.
That's really good advice. I think myself, for people to really appreciate how serious this is and why they need to remain on high alert, it might be helpful if you could explain for us, Reena, just how debilitating a ransomware attack can be for a company in terms of what it does, and then how hard it is to come back from and get back online. Would you mind framing that for us a little bit?
Absolutely. So again, there's been an evolution in the tactics of the cyber criminals when looking at what they're trying to accomplish with ransomware. But ransomware is really meant to, A, disrupt your business, and B, get money, right? They want a ransom and in the form of Bitcoin or some other cryptocurrency. And so the flavor A, I'd say the original flavor of ransomware has been to install this malware in your company's system and lock up your operational or other data. So if you think about if you're a manufacturing company, for example, and the threat actors are able to lock up the server that has all of the customer specifications for the parts that you're manufacturing. Sure, you can continue manufacturing the parts that are already in the pipeline, but can you put in to the pipeline new parts without that data? Certainly it would be a hit to your reputation to go back to those customers and say, hey, can you resend those specifications? And of course, it might actually be impossible given the number of customers that you're dealing with as well. So if you think about what is your crown jewel data as a company, if that was suddenly unavailable to you, what type of revenue loss, what type of loss of goodwill with your customers, what type of contract violations might you be up against because you might have had to provide certain services or products within a particular timeline. So, and that's just the first flavor of ransomware. The second flavor of ransomware, which has been becoming more prevalent over the last year or two, is what I call data publishers. It's extortion. So these threat actors, it sounds wild given the technical nature of this, but there's a ransom note, just like any other type of ransom incident. So there's a note on the system that's left by the cyber criminals, and it indicates instructions on what to do to get the data back. So as companies, I think, have been smarter about getting data backups that are really robust into place that can get your data back maybe within 24 to 48 hours. These threat actors have shifted their approach to taking the data and exfiltrating it. So they downloaded them themselves and then indicating that if the payment isn't made, that they will actually publish that data on some sort of public blog. So particularly think about government defense contractors who have sensitive data that is government facing, or even just major clients, and you have data relating to those clients. The fallout from that type of incident can be tremendous.
And just to take that a step farther too, Reena, I believe I've listened to various webinars that you've been on talking about this subject matter in the past, and I believe I heard at some point that okay, everything's back on track, we're back online, this and that, and you think you're back online in 24 to 48 hours, but it could be weeks before you truly get back online, and that can really harm your business, which is what we're kind of getting ready to get into that part of the discussion anyway.
Yeah, that's a best case scenario. And I think there are some real conversations to be had with the IT folks as well about, what is the best case, but what's really the actual scenario to be able to bring that data back up and be online. And on top of that, you're doing an investigation and having forensic investigators and data breach coaches like myself trying to figure out what happened, contain the damage, because you don't just plug back in and try to get your data. You're really trying to figure out, well, how big is this incident? How many people are involved? Are the threat actors still in the system? Often they are. And you have to take a variety of steps and preserve a lot of data in order to go through that process as well. So it's the importance of focusing on this issue can't be underscored enough.
And I can't imagine anybody's listening to this right now, Reena, and saying to themselves, "Oh, this doesn't sound so bad." I mean, it's really frightening. The more we hear, the more frightening it gets. So, in your experience, for people that may be on the fence about investing in something like this, and you explained it pretty well just a second ago, sometimes people frame this as just an IT issue, but this is not just an IT issue. Why don't you explain and this is more of, in our world, the communications world, what's the irreparable harm that can be done to a company's bottom line, their ability to do business, and their overall image. I know that's like three different questions, but all of them are very serious and can be very grave.
Absolutely. So we've touched on the one which is the most directly related to the bottom line, which is the revenue, right? So you have your data locked up, that revenue stream gets halted. Also, there's an enormous cost to dealing with a data breach. So, paying lawyers and forensic investigators and other consultants and experts. And if you have to notify individuals and the government, there could be follow-on investigations. So there are a lot of fairly direct costs relating to a data security incident. But in addition, you have agreements with your customers that might have notification obligations in the event that any of the confidential information that they have given you under the scope of the agreement was disclosed. And so you might have to go and have those really difficult conversations with your customers. In addition, we're in a competitive environment out in the business world. So if you've had a significant data security incident, first of all, you're going to have to deal with those customers and assure them, spend a lot of time assuring them that you are remediating this issue and that you are going to prevent a similar incident from happening again. But I guarantee you, if you're in a position where you are renewing a contract or they're going out to bid for a contract again, they're not going to forget that situation. And so it's going to come up and you're going to have to show your work in terms of the improvements you've made to your cybersecurity. And anytime you say, hey, here are 10 improvements I've made, the natural question is, why didn't you have those in place beforehand?
I'm eager to know if, and of course, not without naming names, an example or two where you saw firsthand the terrible implications, of an attack of this nature, maybe on one of your clients or elsewhere. But I'm really curious to hear more about that.
Sure. Yeah. Just at a very high level, for example, one incident, the company was a manufacturing company, and they relied on an outside company to do their data backups. And the incident happened. They went to the outside company. That company had not been properly doing the backups. So they had no leverage really in that situation. They needed to pay that ransom. So that's a really, really difficult situation to deal with. Another situation that's a practical scenario that happens from time to time is that, a company will have a wire transfer fraud. So there's another kind of data security incident where a manipulation occurs and the money goes elsewhere. So they might call their bank and say, hey, stop this payment, and the bank freezes their accounts. But then they have some sort of ransomware incident that they have to deal with, and they can't get money out of their bank account because of their prior notice. So you could have a lot of scenarios that can be really difficult to handle. I think the government-facing companies absolutely have a tricky responsibility because they will, once data has been downloaded, they may have a notification obligation to the government. And those contracts are highly competitive and they go out to bid. So the impact is wide-reaching.
And may I ask one more follow-up? What dollar amounts are you seeing in terms of these ransomwares these days, their demands?
You're seeing 7 or 8 figures in terms of the ransomware amounts, especially as the opening bid. Sometimes they do negotiate down, but you're seeing large numbers for the demands.
That's astonishing. Sorry.
No, it is astonishing. And the other thing that I find particularly interesting too, and I think this came from another one of the webinars I was watching you on, Reena, when they were talking about the overall cost of doing this, but also how there's sort of honor amongst thieves, because my inclination was, well, gosh, if they hold you up for ransomware, they have all your information, they can leak it, they can do all this sort of thing. What's going to keep them from just keep, doing it time and time and time again? And I heard that perhaps, no, once we got you, and we're moving on to something else. That's a thing, isn't it?
Yeah, they have reputations among themselves, right? So, remember that each ransomware variant is different, right? So you can tell if it's the same threat actor group. So if this is a threat actor group that's known to take the money and not provide the keys to decrypt your data, or who's a quote unquote persistent threat actor group, so they come back again, that will play into the calculus. We work a lot with law enforcement, for example, the FBI, that tracks various ransomware variants, and they'll tell you, well, this threat actor group is a persistent one. This threat actor group, our information is that they are not persistent, meaning they won't come back once you pay them. The advice from the FBI is always don't pay the ransom, of course, but you can get pieces of information that way. And if a threat actor group gets a reputation as being one who's not quote unquote above board, to the extent that you can call them that, they're going to have a tougher time getting those ransomware payments.
I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, I agree. I've actually never thought about it from that perspective before. Wow. Oh my gosh. Well, honor among thieves, I guess, is accurate. So, Reena, in our communications business, everyone should have a plan in place for risk management. And Rob and I are always advising our clients, to that effect. But often they're coming to us after the fact when bad things have already happened. What I'd love to hear you talk about in terms of cybersecurity is, what do you recommend on the front end to make sure that your company is prepared and to avoid this type of attack as much as possible?
Absolutely. An incident response plan is critical. So an incident response plan is a plan that walks through the who, which is who's the incident response team. As I mentioned, these incidents happen on holidays. Sometimes they happen on weekends. I unfortunately spend a lot of weekends dealing with these incidents because that's when less people are in the office. So you need to know who to contact at 10 o'clock at night on a Friday when this incident happens, and who the team is that needs to get pulled together to make all the decisions. You also need to know how to make the decisions and what steps to take to determine, hey, is this an actual security incident or is this a false alarm? What do we need to do to contain the incident, to remediate it, to look at our notification obligations? So this document is going to lay out all of those steps. I'd recommend, as a larger part within which this incident response plan sits, is having an analysis of, well, where is your sensitive data? What do you need to protect? Do a risk assessment of your company, and then take this incident response plan, test it with a tabletop exercise. So that's where you get a number of people in the room, the decision makers, and you walk through a simulation incident. And I would recommend having, a data security lawyer with you, a forensic investigator with you, potentially a communications person with you, so that you can have all of the key players in the room and you all understand what the values of the company are, what the goals are, and you have a better fleshed out understanding of who your business partners are. That's a really important part for companies, where sometimes they're thinking internally in terms of who needs to be notified, employees, board members, things like that, customers. But you may have, partner organizations that need to have input. For example, hospital systems will have medical practices that are major that they need to contact and be involved in that process. So having an incident response plan as part of your risk assessment as well, having a tabletop exercise done. And then I also recommend having a communications plan. So going through, if you have cyber liability insurance, they'll have a list of preferred vendors that they will cover under the policy. Going through those vendors and identifying, well, here's a company I'd like to work with for forensics. And then I don't want to write down the 1-800 number. I want to get that the person's cell phone number, because you're calling it again 10 p.m. on a Friday night. You don't want to call into a hotline. So really drilling down and having a list of individuals that you're going to call, holding statements for what you might want to say to your constituents and the key stakeholders, and having all of those pieces together as a package.
That's a lot to digest there, isn't it, Eileen?
It is. It's great advice, though. I wear two hats when I come to this podcast, Reena. I'm both a business owner and a communications expert. So it's funny, as you're citing all of those things on the checklist, I'm thinking through obviously we're a very small company on a very small scale. I'm thinking of each of those items and realizing, oh, there's at least one on there that I'm going to go and just shore up right now when we're done.
Absolutely. Well, Reena, I don't want to be repetitive here necessarily, but I think you've already talked about some of the people that need to be involved. If you haven't come up with the plan that you just talked about, and that all of a sudden you're doing, as Eileen mentioned, they call you after the fact and they say, you don't want to hear that, right? I got hacked. What do I do now? What kind of advice would you give our listeners for whom this may happen to? And do you pay the ransomware? Who needs to be called in? I think you touched upon them in terms of having them already in place, but who are the key people that need to be involved once this does happen to you, and how will it help you come back from it?
And I would just add, even what's the first thing you do? Like, I want to have that drilled in my head.
Right.
Yeah, no, the first thing you do, and this is going to sound self-serving, I'm sure, but I promise there's a reason for it, is call your data security attorney, because we can put measures into place to protect the investigation to the extent possible under the attorney-client privilege. And the first thing that I do is figure out, well, who do we need in terms of a forensic investigator to come in and support the IT team and support the company in doing an investigation to determine what happened and what the options are, and then making your claim to your insurer. That's absolutely necessary at the front end. In terms of the incident response team, it varies by organization, but you want to look at, well, who are the functional heads of your organization? You want to have representation across the organization. So of course you have leaders in your IT and your information security groups. If you have those, you want to have your legal and compliance representation. You want to have your finance representation. So if you have a CFO or a finance director, because money is going to be involved here probably. And then you want to have human resources. There's often an internal component. Some of these incidents end up having, some insider activity that you might need to address an employee doing something that improper, or otherwise maybe a disgruntled employee of some type. So having human resources involved is really important for a number of aspects as well. But you also need to know for your organization, well, who at the end of the day is going to make that decision whether to pay the ransomware or not, or the ransom or not. And in a lot of organizations, that goes all the way to the top. So that goes to, the CEO. And that is a surprise a lot of times, because the CEO didn't really think about it. So I can recall being in a tabletop exercise. And so the question comes up, who decides who's going to make the final decision and sign off on whether we pay the ransom? And everybody looks at the CEO. And he had that aha moment. And I will tell you that that's a good way to get senior leadership also really to the table in making sure to fund appropriate, pre-incident exercises, which are, so much less expensive than when an incident hits, right? Doing that preventative work. So really it's an educational tool as well.
And given the number of dollars we're talking about, the big numbers you were talking about earlier, Reena, it's a little surprising that your CEO was a little taken aback by what it's my decision. It's like, yeah, this is the most crucial decision this company's going to make for a while. Of course, it's your decision. I mean, the buck stops with him or her.
Absolutely.
That was really good advice. And thank you. You certainly got me thinking. I'm actually reflecting here on, I recently, really just last week, received a notification from a major professional service provider about a breach in their data, which involved, ransomware and other things. But I'm intrigued because it said that the breach took place in April of this year. And I just received the letter. What's your take on that? Are there any, obligations in terms of communicating? I'm just curious that people, because obviously communications is what we talk about.
Absolutely. So there are 54 data breach notification laws in this country, and they all have different definitions of the type of information they apply to. They all have different tests for when they trigger notification, and most of them have some variation of language stating that please notify as expediently as possible. But if you think about how an incident occurs, you find anomalous behavior in your system, you spin up your incident response team, and then you start looking to see, is it one email account? Is it 5 email accounts? And I will tell you, at least half of the time, what we think happened at the beginning isn't what really happened. So there might be one person's email account, and then you start looking at logs, you start looking at IP addresses to try to figure out, to identify the threat actor, what their actions were in the system. And then you start seeing that, well, it was actually 3 or 4 different email accounts, and they moved laterally by sending a phishing email from one email account to the other. And they send it out broadly, but a few people fall prey to them. So now you have, let's say you have 4 or 5 email accounts, and you have to determine, well, did the threat actors get a chance to download this entire set of emails, which you can do in some ways if you're logging in remotely. Now you have to look through all of those emails to see if there's information that falls within the definition of personal information under those 54 data breach notification laws. Once that's done, there's another test that applies, and then the notification drafting process occurs. And that's when you find out about the anomalous behavior at the time that the investigation, and you start the investigation right away. Sometimes the threat actors are in the system 6 months ago, and you haven't felt the effects of it yet. So you don't discover it until later. So it could be a variety of different things, but I think that the timelines do tend to stretch out for that reason.
You just answered the legal part of the question. And Eileen's scenario is so apropos because I think a lot of people can relate to that. So let's just turn it a little bit one way or the other here and talk about the brand that you're putting at risk here. So if I get something 5 or 6 months after it happened and nobody told me that I needed to be on alert of any kind, I'm a little upset, I have to say, and I think a lot of people would feel the same way. What damage to your brand can you do? You gave us the 54 laws and this and what's the definition and all that, but when it comes to pragmatism, when it comes to maintaining the trust of your customers or clients or whatever it is, you really run the risk here of trying to seem like, listen, nobody wants to admit they had a data breach. That's embarrassing, even though it happens all the time. But you really run the risk of causing your brand some harm here. True?
You absolutely want to do it as quickly as possible. I think there's a logistical problem because you don't know who to notify until you've gone through all those materials, right? There's not a list of people until you've done that process, but it does behoove you to get a team going as quickly as possible and to put the resources behind it. You can do interim measures, and absolutely clients have different approaches on this, but putting something on your website or putting out an email to all of your customers saying, we've been notified we had an incident, we don't know the details of it, we are cooperating. This is another, I think, risk mitigating technique and a good thing to do if you contact law enforcement, saying you're cooperating with law enforcement on the incident. But there absolutely are ways to send out messages that are not the full notification in advance to manage your brand reputation.
That's really good advice. I don't think that necessarily would have occurred to me. I'll just share, my own personal reactions when I received this letter. I thought initially, true, my immediate reaction was, wait a minute, this took place in April, huh?
Right.
That was a little bit of what, kind of went through my mind. But then as a communications, professional, I'm an expert who's done this for 25 plus years. I walked through all those scenarios in my head, not as in detail because I don't have the same depth of knowledge that you do, Reena. But I did think, okay, I'm just going to assume that they were doing due diligence and therefore they didn't notify me until it became evident that we may have been affected. So fair enough. You know what I mean? But someone without my background may have a really different reaction with only getting a communication 5 or 6 or whatever many months later. So that interim approach that you just suggested sounds very wise to me as a communications professional. And that's a takeaway I definitely going to remember. And I think our listeners should really, perk up and take note of too.
Yeah, all of these scenarios are really tricky balancing of considerations that are the legal and then the business and the practical. And so you really have to right size it for your organization and, assess what the risks are, right? I think with any communication, right, in terms of a crisis management situation, how much information you put out there and when. Are there other news stories relating to this that are giving incorrect information about this incident? We've certainly dealt with that type of scenario as well. So it's not a one size fits all, absolutely, but they're, balancing and keeping an eye on all those considerations is important.
Well, thank you, Reena. I think this advice has been so incredibly valuable, and I'm certain our listeners will find it equally actionable, which is something I really appreciate when listening to experts like yourself. I really hope they also take it to heart and activate on a lot of the suggestions that you've made here. But if there are listeners who are interested in contacting you, what's the best way for them to do that?
You can Google my name. There's only one Reena Bajowala out there that I'm aware of.
That's great.
My bio will pop up, but you can contact me via email at reena.bajowala@icemiller.com. But my contact information is there, or link up with me on LinkedIn. Happy to always have a conversation about someone's cybersecurity maturity.
Excellent.
Incredible stuff.
Yeah. Thank you. We really appreciate you being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for the expertise, Reena. This was absolutely terrific. And I'm sure a lot of people listening have had their eyes open in ways that perhaps they weren't thinking about that. Now, before we leave, we want to give you some tips that you might find helpful. That aforementioned PwC report gave some good advice when it comes to mitigating some of the risks. The 4 P's to reaching your cyber potential. The first is principle, PLE, meaning that the CEO must be able to articulate an explicit, clear principle establishing security and privacy as a business necessity. And Reena touched upon the buck stopping with the CEO and what he or she needs to be thinking about when it comes to this. Then people, hire the right leader and let your IT folks connect with the business teams. Make sure there's good coordination and communication there, because these good people can help simplify what can be a very complex process to many of us that may not have that technical expertise. And then there is prioritization. Your risks will change as you become more ambitious digitally. Make sure you use your data and your intelligence to continually measure those risks. And finally, perception. You cannot secure what you can't see. And I think Reena touched upon it earlier in this thing, but I'm going to say it a little bit differently. Make sure those blind spots in your relationships and your supply chains are identified and addressed to make sure that you can handle this very weighty issue.
And that's it for another episode of Can You Hear Me? We'd like to thank you, Reena Bajowala of Ice Miller, once again for being our special guest. And thank you for listening once again, everybody. I'm Eileen Rochford, CEO of the Harbinger Group.
And I'm Rob Johnson, president of Rob Johnson Communications. We hope you will join us next time. In the meantime, you can listen to us wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and more. Thanks for listening.